thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I'm really excited to talk to you, to give a second talk of the day. This is also going to be very high level, but a little bit more technical than what Dan was talking about. So we will overview the design space of proof of work and proof of stake consensus protocols. Since I'm a research partner at SA16Z, I have to say that I will be speaking at my individual capacity here and not necessarily representing the opinions of the firm. So that out of the way, let's start. So at a high level, I'm going to structure my talk as follows. So I'll again explain you what is a blockchain, maybe in more technical terms. And then we'll look into two paradigms for building blockchains, proof of work and proof of stake. These are kind of two schools of thoughts for designing blockchains. We'll see the differences, the advantages of both of them. And then for the second half, we'll focus on proof of stake blockchains alone, and we'll see two paradigms for building those blockchains too, called longest chain, BFT, and the hybrid of the two. So let me start with explaining again what is a blockchain, kind of reiterating what Dan already told you about. Blockchain is a chain of blocks starting from the genesis, so everybody has to agree what the genesis block is going to look like. And then each block in the chain consists of the list of transactions, list of messages from the users who are interacting with the blockchain, and a hash of the previous block. Okay? So the hash of the previous block is what actually makes the blockchain a chain, because a single block then uniquely determines all the history that precedes this block starting from Genesis. So because the hash function is collision resistant, we won't be able to find another alternative history that will lead to this same block. Just because the hash is there, it attests to the full history. So that kind of already should hint you at how we're going to be building consensus. We don't need to agree on the whole history, we just need to agree on the latest block, and that will attest that we agree on the whole history of the blockchain. We will be looking into building blockchains that satisfy two properties, safety and liveness. So for safety, we will make everybody agree on history. So what it means is that if, say, all the people in this audience, we each download a blockchain from some source that we trust, this can be different sources for each one of us, or we can maybe consult different sources, but we end up with a blockchain locally downloaded to our devices. Just by looking at the blockchain that we downloaded without talking to each other, just by looking at what we have locally, we should be able to figure out what's the latest block that we all will agree on, or most of us will agree on. Okay, and this should be a relatively recent block. So that's what means for the blockchain to be safe. So that we all will have an agreement on large enough kind of historical prefix of the blockchain. Maybe we'll have some disagreement around the latest blocks, but for the most part of the blockchain, we'll agree on what it is. So that's safety. Now, what's liveness? Liveness says that every valid transaction should eventually get added to the blockchain. So in particular, interestingly, this means that the blockchain is not censoring. Because if the blockchain is not censoring, it means that somebody who is submitting a valid transaction will not be able to get it through and will not be able to get it written to the blockchain. So now you may ask a philosophical question, well, what if the blockchain is censoring? Does it stop being a blockchain? And technically, no. Of course, for users who are not being censored, the blockchain may still function just fine. And they may not even notice that the blockchain is censoring some of the users. But of course, the blockchain stops being a blockchain in its spirit if it starts to censor, and it loses this fundamental property that the blockchains are praised for. So a lot of thought in the community nowadays goes into trying to architect the blockchain so that censorship is not possible, trying to limit the centralization forces so it keeps being decentralized, and we are not introducing any single point of failure that we can attack and start censoring transactions. It's a very, very delicate balance to hold. So I also want to make a note here that the blockchain doesn't have to order transactions. It can order arbitrary messages as well. And as Dan was explaining, for example, you can accept DAO votes or auction bids. So but the blockchain needs to have the cryptocurrency component in it. So every transaction should submit a small fee to the network in order to incentivize the participants of the network to include this transaction in the log. So I'll talk about that in just a second a little bit. But this notion of transaction seems to be very important. So that's why every blockchain project you hear about also introduces a cryptocurrency along the way. So transactions in the blockchain can be simple money transfers. So that's the simplest blockchain you can imagine. So in this case, a blockchain prefix will define a database. It's a key value store that maps the public keys to the coin values. It basically tells you how many coins are there under each of the public keys. Okay, so when we look at the prefix of the blockchain, it exactly determines this database of the mapping between the public keys and the values. And each block of transactions will have transfers signed by the users who hold the public key on the blockchain. So the new block will be a list of transactions. Each transaction will be sending some value of coins from under the public key into the new public key. And this transaction is going to be signed by the sender. So each block will induce a redistribution of coins under these public keys. And when we apply this block, now the prefix of the blockchain together with the new block defines a new distribution of coins between accounts. So that's kind of the simplest blockchain you can think about. But it doesn't have to be about just coin transfers. It can be more generic. And in the most generic sense, the blockchain prefix defines the state of the database D, and each new block alters this database, so moving it from some state D to some other state F of D. And the more expressive the functions that are allowed, this set F, the more interesting the blockchain becomes. So for example, Bitcoin is more suitable for simple coin transfers and more similar to this design, whereas Ethereum allows for more rich set of functions to be applied to the database, and that's why it gave rise to the DeFi applications, and we have very interesting stuff built on top of Ethereum. Okay, now we looked into kind of what is a blockchain. This talk will focus on the other part, on how do we build it. So I explained you what a block is. Now let's look into more the chain part. So the blockchain, as I was explaining, is built by the set of nodes who accept transactions from the users. And these transactions should somehow be packed into a block and appended as a new block to the blockchain. So there is this two sets of parties. One are users, or clients, who send transactions, and the other set of parties is nodes who cooperate with each other on building the next block, and this next block is just a list of ordered transactions from the users. So the block is appended, it's a two-step process. First, a proposer is elected to announce a new block. So among these nodes who are actively participating in building a blockchain, we first need to elect a proposer to announce a new block. And second, everybody decides on whether to accept what the proposer have proposed or drop it and elect a new proposer. So why is there a two-step process here? So essentially, the proposer election limits your choices for the second step. So when you need to decide on the proposed block, you have fewer options to decide upon, so that makes consensus easier. If in the first phase you're either elected one proposer or few, you agree ahead of time who are the valid proposers to propose the blocks. So you just need to make sure basically all the nodes in the network, they are unopinionated around what transaction set to include, at least in the ideal world. We'll talk about MEV later on, where we'll see that in the real world that's not quite the case, and nodes have opinions around how they want the block to be structured. But in an ideal blockchain world, we want the nodes to be unopinionated, and any proposer who is proposing a set of transactions should be deemed valid, and as long as those transactions are valid, they should be appended to the blockchain. All right, so there are two mechanisms for proposer election alone. So we'll be looking at the first step here. One approach is using proof of work, and another is using proof of stake. So some of the earlier blockchain designs, like Bitcoin, for example, the first cryptocurrency we had, was using proof of work for proposer election. So let me explain how it works. The proposer can be anybody. So anybody who wants to participate in building the blockchain will search for a block of transactions B, such that the hash of the block is less than the target value. So we will assume that our hash function goes from binary arbitrary string, so it can in particular hash the block, and will output 256 bits long values. So the proposer needs to find the block B such that the hash of it is less than 2 to the 256 divided by the difficulty D, and the difficulty D is determined by the current state of the blockchain. For the proposer, it will take time roughly linear in D to find such a hash, to find such a block that will hash to the value less than the target. And currently for Bitcoin, D is about 2 to the 45, and this parameter is tuned such that one block is found once in every 10 minutes. So the proposers operating large data centers that are just the whole purpose of which is to solve these hash puzzles. So those large machines that consume a lot of electricity, typically all they do is they're trying to find equivalent permutations of the block such that the hash of the block is less than the target. So they're doing just a lot of brute force work. It's highly parallelizable. So the more machines you have, the more likely you are to find the block that will match the puzzle. So once the proposer found the block, it announces it to the peers. And it's very easy to verify the proposer. You just hash the block, and if it's less than a target, you know the proposer is okay to propose. So since blocks are hard to find, parameters of the schemes are tuned in such a way that it's very rare that the block is found, so typically once in every 10 minutes roughly. As a result, we have a very small number of possible proposers who are submitting valid blocks to us. And as a result, we simplify the consensus decision for us. So if listening to the whole world, we only hear a few proposals for the blocks, it's very easy, it's easier for us to decide as a network on which proposer to pick, which block to decide on, if there are just few of them. And I will show you how exactly this decision is made. This is the second part that is a consensus mechanism coming after proposer election. But the proposer election mechanism in itself achieves these three properties. It's live, so blocks are proposed regularly due to the tuning of the scheme. So if you don't get blocks for a long time, you lower the difficulty, making it easier for miners to mine blocks, and so you start having blocks more regularly. There's this tuning parameter in the protocol. The proposer election is also fair, so each miner is elected proportional to its computational power. That's the definition of fairness for the scheme. And it's also permissionless, so it's open participation. Anybody can just buy a machine from a hardware store and try to find, collect transactions from the users and try to find permutation of these transactions such that the hash of the block is less than the target. So it's a very permissionless system, open for participation, although, of course, nowadays there are a lot of companies dedicated to mining, to proposing blocks, because block proposers also get rewarded for proposing blocks, and so it's kind of maybe harder to enter this market because there are already big companies whose sole purpose is to be solving these hash puzzles and proposing blocks. But still, as a small miner, you can join a mining pool and with participants as same as you, and be mining on small machines. You'll just have smaller probability of winning, but the rewards will be divided between participants of the pool. So proof of work had been long criticized for being very, very lossy in terms of electricity, and it's useful to look at concrete numbers. So Bitcoin consuming about 85 terawatt hours per year. These are numbers from June 2022. And Ethereum used to be proof of work, and this summer was consuming about the same on par with Bitcoin. And they together are consuming as much as the Argentina, for example. So the power consumption of these two cryptocurrencies is on par with a small country, which should be quite worrisome. On the other hand, you can look at the mining gold industry. So mining gold industry also consumes a lot of electricity, and Ethereum and Bitcoin combined are still consuming less than the mining gold. So you can argue that although those cryptocurrencies are quite wasteful, they are not as wasteful as some older form of money that we were used to. And Dan mentioned why we're focusing on Ethereum a lot. In this talk, we'll be focusing on Ethereum and Bitcoin, because those are two largest cryptocurrencies. If you look at the market cap, Bitcoin is about 40% of the whole system, of the whole market of cryptocurrencies, and Ethereum actually is also about 40% if you also include tokens built on top of Ethereum to it. So Bitcoin and Ethereum combined kind of support 80% of the market cap of all the cryptocurrencies. It's also interesting to look at the graph of how the power consumption grows for Bitcoin. The power consumption is proportional to the hash power that the network has at the moment. So the hash power is measured in the number of hashes that all of the miners combined do per second. And I think that I want to highlight that there is a very useful number to keep in mind that you can deduce from Bitcoin hash rate. So current Bitcoin hash rate is 200 exahashes per second. That's about 2 to the 76 hashes per 10 minutes. So that's a lot of hashing. And we used to assume that 80-bit secure crypto systems are fine, but well, these numbers, they might not seem to be that fine, because Bitcoin is doing almost 2 to the 80 hashes in some reasonable amount of time. But it's also useful to see how much the miners get rewarded for doing that much hashing. And per block, miners' reward is 6.25 Bitcoin, so that's about $150,000 per 10 minutes. So combining these two numbers, it's kind of useful to remember that, roughly speaking, you can argue that the network that's doing the network can do 276 hashes per second for just $150,000. That's useful when you set up parameters probably for your crypto system, so to understand what would be the cost of attacking your crypto system. And that's a rough numbers, but it's unlikely you're gonna get that much hash power out of any single machine. You have to incentivize a large network of worldwide miners to achieve this number, but still that's kind of how the crypto economic works out. So yeah, and just to make a point here that 2 to the 80 bits of security is not enough. That's quite cheap to attack nowadays, and this is just a useful number to track the hash. And you see that the power consumption and the hash rate of Bitcoin climbs up pretty rapidly, so maybe it's interesting to get updates on this number from time to time. Now the question is, so we see that Bitcoin and in general proof of work cryptocurrencies are very, very wasteful. Can we make them better somehow without kind of re-engineering them too much? And there were a lot of attempts trying to make Bitcoin better. First, increasing the block size. But unfortunately, that introduces delays in block propagation, so the chain starts to fork a lot, and that decreases reliability. We can also try to increase the frequency of the blocks, and some theoretical work has shown that it probably can be reduced, but not by much. From 10 minutes, maybe we can get to 1 minute 1 minute interval for the block generation. Very interesting research is going on in the Lightning networks that are trying to facilitate, to move a lot of the transaction activity off-chain and only use the blockchain as a settlement layer in case there is a dispute going on off-chain. So that's also an interesting direction to make proof of work better. Better, I mean, make it handle more transactions than it currently handles. And the other interesting line of work is trying to change the proof of work puzzle from proof of this useful work where you're just hashing a lot of blocks, you're not really producing anything useful other than limiting your proposal selections. Maybe you can do something more useful. For example, ask miners to solve some traffic problems or fault proteins or something like that. So there are interesting proposals in that regard as well, but we haven't seen anything practical yet proposed. So maybe that's an interesting problem for research as well. Can you repurpose a proof of work blockchain to something that can be proof of useful work? And finally, I want to mention the Bitcoin NG work stream that's trying to elect leader for a longer duration of time, so you don't have to run a lot of hashing to elect leaders every 10 minutes. You can elect leader once, solving the proof of work puzzle once, and then this leader will be working for some longer duration. And then you'll run a proof of work puzzle again to select the next leader for a longer duration. So you'll be asking the network to find solutions to the puzzles less frequently. So, before I move to proof of stake, I want to show how the idea of proof of stake, where the idea is coming from. So in the ideal world, where let's imagine we only have the coins from the blockchain. So all of our money are on the blockchain. The miner holding these assets on the blockchain kind of moves these assets out of the blockchain and turns them into his real-world infrastructure. So it spends the money to build these mining farms that it will use to be computing solutions to the hash puzzles. Okay, so the miner is taking money out and burning them to produce this physical infrastructure. Then the miner will be rewarded for his work proportional to the computational power, proportional basically to the money it spent on his infrastructure. So everything here scales really nicely. If the miner doubles the amount of coins that it spends, it basically doubles its infrastructure and it will double its reward because it will be elected as proposer twice more often. So at the end, the miner's reward is proportional to the money that it spent. The idea of proof of stake is instead of having the miner spend this money, why don't we just leave it inside the protocol and we just have the miner lock the money? And then we will reward the miner for doing good work proportionally to the amount of money that it locked. And the more money the miner locks, the bigger is his reward. So we preserve this linear scaling of the system, but we kind of eliminated this real-world component altogether, and now miners in this system have a chance of not spending, not producing such a vast electricity loss. So the idea of the proof of stake at a high level is the validator, or a miner in this case, locks T coins, n is the total number of validators. So we now know who will be the validating just based on the users who've locked their coins, indicating that they will be validators. So we have this fixed number n on the number of validators, which we didn't have before in proof of work, because anybody can become a validator and kind of show up out of nowhere In contrast, in this scheme, we'll have a fixed number of validators. And I'll show you why this is very important in just a second. And the simplest approach when we have a fixed number of validators now is to elect proposers by round robin, by just going through the proposer list one by one and asking them to propose the next block of transactions. This election mechanism is live. Of course, round robin is a pretty simple scheme. It's hard to attack. It's fair, so each leader is each validator is elected as a proposer with probability 1 over n, and it's permissionless. It's open participation. As long as you can acquire coins on this blockchain, you can then log them into the smart contract and start being a validator. Yes?
So you're saying I need to log... Hey, so I need to lock coins for this proof of stake. What do you mean by lock? Like, do I get them back?
Yeah, great question. So you are locking these coins for the duration that you're a validator, and that also gives a mechanism for the blockchain to slash bad validators in case they misbehave in some observable way. For example, they propose bad blocks, or maybe they double vote. They try to propose 2 conflicting blocks. So in this case, typically the chain implements mechanisms that allows to slash the validator. So kind of subtract a little bit of coins from the coin pod that it locked. But yes, typically after you decided you don't want to be validator anymore, you can withdraw your locked coins and just become an ordinary user again.
Yeah, so maybe it's slightly different from proof of work where I buy hardware or the electricity, like I don't get that back. Like,
yeah, good question. Yeah, in proof of work, though you can maybe decide to sell your hardware at some point if you don't want to validate anymore. Of course, the market can be pretty scarce, so it may be hard to sell a mining farm. But in principle, maybe you can repurpose it. And yeah, that's a great point, that it's not so easy to stop being a validator in proof of work. The proof of stake is pretty easy. So, yes?
So this is built already on top of the consensus, right? So there's already a consensus protocol in the top of this.
Yeah, great question. So we didn't get to consensus yet. This is just proposer election. And next, I'll focus on the consensus mechanism that helps you decide on whether what the proposer proposes is actually a block that we want to accept or not. Okay?
We have to realize the proposal, like the consensus protocol.
Exactly. That's part of the consensus protocol, but that's only half of it. So the second half will kind of decide, we as a network will decide whether we want this block or we don't want this block, and we will wait for the next proposer to propose something else. Yeah, great questions. I want to mention that there are different staking design choices for blockchains. Some blockchains decide to allow validators to lock fixed amount of coins. For example, Ethereum asks each validator to lock about exactly 32 ETH. Or the staking can be variable, and then you will be rewarded your validators proportional to how much they staked. But you can always mimic variable staking with fixed staking. It's going to be quantized. Yeah, so if you want to be a validator with 64 ETH locked, you'll just run 2 validator nodes and use the fixed staking mechanism. Some blockchains natively allow delegation of stake. So if you're just a coin holder and you don't know how to validate, you don't want to be a validator, still you can delegate your coins to the validator you trust, and this validator will now use your coins to log them, and a validator will pay you back some small fee. Delegation can be baked into the protocol, or it can happen naturally. So if it's not baked into the protocol, it typically happens naturally because coin holders, they can have some reward from lending their stake to the validators, who then will reward those coin holders back from the proposer rewards. And I want to mention also that some protocols want to limit the number of validators. And we'll look more into that in just a second, but there are two approaches. Random selection of subcommittees, so every time you will kind of select a random subset from your validator set to be operating the blockchain, so you'll have some chances to be selected, but during some periods of time you will not be a validator. And delegation also helps you limit the number of validators. So you can say we only allow 20 validators, and then you can delegate the stake. If you're not validating, you can still delegate your stake to the 20 active ones. But for this talk, we'll assume fixed staking and no delegation. One of the most exciting positive events that happened in 2022, actually in September 15, in the crypto community was the merge. Ethereum switched its consensus mechanism, its proposed election mechanism from proof of work to proof of stake. Was a celebratory event. It went amazingly smoothly, although many compare it to fixing an airplane while it's flying. But no attacks has happened. There's nothing to report. It's just a lot of art was produced, and probably it will become part of textbooks at some point. And Ethereum stopped producing electricity almost altogether. It's like now producing not more than a moderate-sized data center. So it's reduced its electricity consumption by 30,000x. And actually, world electricity consumption noticeably, like by 0.2%. Although some argue that it just takes time for the miners who were operating on Ethereum to repurpose themselves to other blockchains, so maybe that will come back up. It seems that miners are now, who were solving crypto puzzles for Ethereum, are now trying to repurpose to zero-knowledge proving, because most of the mining on Ethereum was happening using GPUs. And kind of GPUs are friendly to zero-knowledge proving. Maybe we'll see more on that tomorrow. But somehow, ASIC mining didn't pick up for Ethereum, and ASICs weren't built, because Ethereum has a little bit different hash puzzle than Bitcoin. So maybe it was just not around for too long for the ASICs to be built. But most of the mining on Bitcoin is happening through ASICs, and on Ethereum it was happening through GPUs, which is a good thing, because now these GPUs can be repurposed maybe for something else and not going to be wasteful. All right, so we focused on the first part, which is how we elect proposers, and there are two mechanisms, proof of work and proof of stake. We'll now look at the second part of how we now decide on whether what was proposed should be accepted or dropped. And there are two mechanisms for the second part. One is longest chain, and another is BFT. So taking kind of a bird's-eye view of these two approaches, the longest chain consensus process is entirely inherited from the proof of work, and just it's repurposing the proof of work consensus to proof of stake. So for the most part, there is no innovation there, and I'll show you concrete protocols, and you will see that it's very similar to Bitcoin. But what has not been possible before with proof of work and only became possible with proof of stake is to bring this vast block of research literature from the 80s on BFT consensus. So those were dealing with designing reliable systems where you distribute your computation among the servers, and you want to maintain the correctness of the system even in the presence of Byzantine faults on the servers. So this is called Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols. But we only know how to build such protocols if we have a fixed validator set. So it's assumed that we need to know all of the validators who are operating together with us in order to be able to run a BFT-style system. And now with proof of stake, we know the validator set becomes fixed because those validators are locking coins. So you know exactly who are the validators, how many of them are there, and now it's possible to build consensus mechanisms using BFT system because of that. We'll briefly also touch on the hybrid between the two. So going back to kind of the beginning, for consensus, we want these two properties, safety and liveness, as I was explaining. So safety means everybody agrees on history, and liveness means that every valid transaction should eventually get added. We'll also want our system to be resilient against Byzantine validators, and we will ideally want to make some minimal network assumption. The most stringent network model is a synchronous model, where you assume that all the validators have a shared global clock, and there is a known bound delta on network delays between each pair of nodes. Partial synchronous model is a little weaker than that. It says that we have shared global clock, and there exists a bound on network delay, we just don't know it. So when we design in partial synchronous model, we typically argue the properties of the systems based on this delta, but we don't necessarily know delta. And there is equivalent reformulation of the partial synchronous model saying that the network becomes synchronous after some unknown time called global stabilization time, GST, when we don't know how the network behaves. It can be completely asynchronous. But it's guaranteed to become synchronous and continue to be synchronous. So that's kind of two formulations that are equivalent for partial synchronous model. That's a relaxation on synchronous model. And asynchronous is the best model, is the most relaxed. We make no assumptions about the network whatsoever, so no bounds on network delay, no nothing. And it also subsumes network partitions, when we can have a devastating effect. Half of the nodes get completely separated from another half. Maybe a large country builds a firewall around themselves, or something happened and we cut through transatlantic cables. So network partitions are also part of the asynchronous model. So now that we have a fixed validator set, we can now look at the space in which we can achieve these two properties is very well kind of defined, and we have a lot of possibility and impossibility results. So it's easy kind of to see where we can fit our protocols and what can be achieved and what cannot. So in Synchrony, for example, we know how to build live and safe consensus protocols that can handle any number of Byzantine thresholds. We know particularly efficient protocols where the number of Byzantine thresholds is less than half. In partial Synchrony, if we want to maintain both properties, we can only tolerate Byzantine third, and we cannot possibly tolerate more than that. Asynchronous case is a little bit different in that we know that there are no deterministic protocols that achieve consensus in asynchrony, even with a single Byzantine threshold, but we can have expected guarantees in asynchrony. Expected number of rounds, or expected runtime to expected time to consensus. And when talking about partial synchrony model, we also will be worrying about the case where we have a network partition. So in all the protocols we're going to look at next, we will also be asking ourselves a question, how the protocol going to behave if there is a network partition, if half of the validators get separated from another half, like which properties the consensus will maintain. It turns out that it's theoretically impossible to maintain both properties, but you can maintain one of them, and you need to pick which one you want to maintain. So different protocols will, one set of protocols will be maintaining liveness during network partition, and another set of protocols will be maintaining safety. All right, so for this talk, I will be focusing on partial synchronous model and also partial synchrony with network partitions. That's what we're going to be designing for. I really encourage you, if you want to dive deeper into consensus literature, to check out the YouTube lectures by Tim Rovgarden. He has a full course on theoretical results in consensus. A16Z published a consensus canon where you can find foundational papers in this field to read and to get yourself familiar with kind of foundational results as well as more recent results. And I really recommend the website of Itai, where he publishes high-level descriptions of most recent papers, also invites other people to write about their research. It's a very nice high-level resource to learn about consensus, what are the most recent advancements that are happening there. All right, so I'll now show you the two families of protocols. So the desired consensus properties to keep in mind that these protocols are going to be satisfying is safety, liveness, resilience to a third of Byzantine validators, and partial synchronous model. Yeah, remember, we cannot handle more than a third of Byzantine validators if we are in a partial synchronous model. So that's our design space for the next half. And as I was saying, there are two paradigms for building the blockchain, longest chain versus BFT. And it's a nice exercise to kind of look at the most popular blockchain projects and see what consensus mechanism they use. So let's take the 30 blockchains by the market cap and remove those that are not that are ERC20 tokens. So I just removed the tokens that don't have their own consensus, that are built on other blockchains. Most of them are Ethereum based. And what we are left with, we can color code. We can basically say whether this is a proof of work longest chain consensus, whether this is BFT proof of stake, or longest chain proof of stake. And you can see that most of them can't be color coded in these three colors. So Bitcoin, for example, is proof of work. Ethereum just moved to proof of stake, but it remains in the spirit to be similar to what it used to be. So it's a longest chain, but proof of stake. There are a bunch of BFT protocols. The outcome kind of this exercise is to show you that really most of the blockchain projects follow one of the two paradigms. It's either longest chain or BFT. Yes?
Question to the previous slide. Can you tell about 27 and 30? Why there aren't marked as any of those? What are the protocols there?
Yeah, great question. So there are some unicorns kind of doing something a little different that's a little hard to put in those two buckets. Algorand, I would say, is more like a mix of longest chain and BFT, so it's kind of a hybrid. For Avalanche, that's a very different style of building a blockchain. What I was explaining is leader-based protocols, where you need to elect a proposer and then you try to agree on what the proposer proposed. But Avalanche is leaderless mechanism, so it doesn't elect proposers. Avalanche naturally works well with the UTXO model, so yeah, anyway, so this is just not a protocol that will fall into these two categories, but there are also other interesting protocols that are just harder to categorize, but we will...
Also, I'm like, maybe not surprised because I know what is behind, but Solana is advertising themselves as proof of history, not like any of those non-work or stake.
Yeah, great question. So I did my best in trying to color code those. I know, yeah, people can get opinionated and kind of say, no, we're not that, we are that. Yeah, I was trying to study Solana protocol. I came to the conclusion that it's a hybrid of longest chain and BFT, despite them having this proof of history component. I think the proof of history component is more for easier synchronization between the servers in Solana. Yeah, I think you can use more colors here. Just a very...
Not really. I agree with you that the proof of history in the Solana is more like the advertisement term than like real what they are doing to achieve consensus.
Yeah, I think they even call their consensus Tower BFT, so they say it's a kind of BFT style with some, yeah, longest chain component there. Yeah, great question. So, yeah, that's, you should take it with a grain of salt. That's very rough coloring. So let's first look at the longest chain style consensus. So in longest chain consensus, each validator will locally maintain a tree of blocks. Occasionally, there will be multiple blocks extending the same block, so each validator will locally store this kind of tree of blocks starting from the genesis. Because of the collision resistance of the hash function, we cannot have any cycles here, so it's guaranteed to be a tree. In longest chain consensus, a proposer is elected per slot, so everybody has synchronized clocks, and the proposer is elected per fixed amount of time per slot from the validator set, and those protocols can handle well multiple proposers. So occasionally, for example, for block 5, you can have 2 proposers that are proposing blocks, and when it's your turn to be a proposer, and you want to figure out which chain to extend, you pick the chain from this tree. You pick one chain according to a fork choice rule. And then you create a block on top of that and publish it to the network. The type of the fork choice rule depends on the blockchain project. So different blockchain projects use different fork choice rules. The most common one, usually it's some greedy algorithm. So, and the most popular rule is longest chain, so the chain that has more blocks in it. And that's, for example, the Bitcoin also selects the longest chain. Well, in fact, it's a little more subtle. They select the chain with the most difficulty on it, so where more mining work has been spent. And the parameters of the system are very delicate in longest chain consensus. They're tuned so that with high probability, only one chain eventually wins. So if you follow the evolution of this chain, for example, for block 3, we had a good proposer who proposed one block. In block 4, the proposer somehow failed. Maybe it was Byzantine, maybe it was just sleepy, didn't propose anything. For slot number 5, we have 2 proposers. And then for slot number 6, maybe this proposer knew about both blocks proposed, but it kind of broke ties in favor of the top one and built on top of that. For time slot 7, maybe the proposer didn't hear about what the proposer in block in time slot 6 proposed and extended the bottom chain. So it can get quite forky. But the parameters are tuned such that it's guaranteed that eventually you will have one chain winning and the rest will kind of stop growing. It's interesting also to look at the Ethereum fork choice rule. It's called LMD Ghost. It's latest message-driven protocol. What it means is that we have a validator set, and each validator gets a chance to vote on a block during a designated slot. So it knows exactly when it's going to have to vote, and when the validator votes, it selects a branch to vote on based on the following greedy algorithm. So you count the number of votes of the the latest votes of the validators in the subtree. So in this example, the yellow stars are the latest votes from the validators. So you count the number of votes in each of the subtrees. Yeah, right. So you have 8 votes in this whole subtree. You have 5 votes in this subtree. Yeah, 3 votes for this block, etc. And then you're going from the genesis down, and you select blocks in a greedy way, just with the largest number. So here, instead of 3, you're going to pick 5, because that's larger, and then you're going to pick 3. And if you have to propose, it's your time to propose, you will propose on top of the block 3. Okay, that's how you select one chain out of this tree of blocks. All right, so if we kind of reason about the properties of longest chain consensus, finality is always eventual.
I have a question on the previous slides. When is the other chain dropped?
Oh, when is the other chain dropped?
Yeah.
well, the protocol usually defines the time when, but you can also, yeah, defines the time where you do not observe any activity on the chain and you know it's safe to drop. Some protocols define the length. Yeah, like, you know, if you go that many blocks back, you know the chain is very unlikely to grow there, so it's safe to prune those branches. So it depends on the...
And what happened to the transactions? Are they back in the transaction pool and sort of included in future blocks of the chain that's kept, or?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, typically those transactions re-enter the mempool. But also it's quite likely that those transactions already appeared in some other branches. So when you're pruning the blocks, it's already likely that those transactions have been included in some longer chain that you're still keeping.
And if you have the same transaction in the long chain and in the shortest chain, how do you make sure there's no double spending? Yeah,
exactly. So you need to, that's exactly the problem with this blockchain, that you need to wait a lot of time to make sure that the transaction is finalized, that one chain eventually won with this transaction, and that it's not going to be reverted. So in these protocols, you only get probabilistic finality guarantee. You don't get deterministic finality, and the more blocks you wait, the more assurance you have that the transaction will not be reverted. And it's interesting also to look at how long you have to wait based on what are the policies on the exchanges. So some of the exchanges might have you wait about a day. If that's a really large transfer and they want to allow you to cash out, you'll have to wait a long time before you're allowed to do so. And for some of the smaller transfers, it can maybe you can wait for 6 blocks or so. That's about an hour. But it's true that it's not quite satisfactory state of affairs, that you only get probabilistic guarantees. You never know whether your transaction is written permanently or whether it's going to get reverted. There's always a small chance that it will get reverted from the blockchain. So that's why longest chain consensus protocols are a little hard for the users and not very user-friendly. And I was saying that we're also looking how the protocol behaves in case of a network partition, and this particular longest chain consensus approach will maintain liveness while not maintaining safety. So if you have the validator set separated in two, they will start growing two conflicting forks, and it will be possible, if you can breach the partition, it will be possible to double spend your coins with one validator set and with another. So the blockchain doesn't maintain safety, but since it continues growing, it maintains liveness. What's nice about these types of protocols is that it can easily support unlimited validator set. And when you have unlimited validator set, you have to connect the validators with some flexible network topology when you have nodes connected to some fixed number of other nodes, and these nodes are connected to fixed number of other nodes, etc. So it's typically 10 to 20 nodes that each one node connects to, and when it wants to broadcast, for example, a block, it will broadcast the block to its peers, and those peers will broadcast to their peers, and so on. And that's how the block is going to propagate through the network via gossip. All right. Yes?
Shouldn't safety be impossible if there's a network partition, no matter what why does it matter that it's long distance? Shouldn't it not be possible in any case?
Well, you can. We're going to see another style of blockchain that maintains safety in that it halts. So it kind of detects the network partition and just stops accepting new blocks. So it kind of loses liveness because you can't continue growing it. You have to wait till your network is restored, but it completely halts detecting the partition. Great question. So for BFT consensus, the chain is not forking. So a proposer is elected again from the validator set. It proposes a block, and then the validators work together finalizing this block. So it's either gets finalized or not. And so you don't... Okay. Great. So one of the most famous protocols is Tendermint from 2016. Just to give a flavor, we're going to hear more about consensus on day 3, I think. But this is how the typical BFT protocol works. The proposer proposes to the nodes, and then the nodes vote, typically in 2 stages. So they vote by signing what the proposer has proposed, and then advertising their vote to the network. So you can see the point I want to make here is those Tendermint protocol is quadratic in terms of communication, and then there are better protocols, more recent ones, for example, Hot Stuff from 2019 that makes the communication linear, and it also achieves responsiveness in that if your network becomes faster, you start finalizing faster. So you proceed with the network speed. Just to briefly mention the innovation of the Hot Stuff is first you can reroute all the communication through the leader, so you can kind of send your messages back to the leader, and the leader will rebroadcast to the rest of the network. So that's how you avoid the quadratic communication. And then the other innovation of Hot Stuff is that it can be pipelined, so you can basically run confirmation for one block in parallel with confirmation for the block of the next proposer, and you can very cleverly combine those two in parallel fashion such that each node is basically only has to vote once per slot. And in particular, in Hot Stuff, the block gets committed after the 3 blocks built on top of it, and you know exactly when your block is going to get committed to the blockchain. So the properties of BFT consensus are completely symmetrical. It has deterministic, usually immediate finality. It's safe under partition, but it's not live. Unfortunately, since there's a lot of communication going on between validators, every validator is communicating with every other validator, it's not so friendly to having multiple validators. The more validators you have, the slower your consensus becomes. So it's typical for the BFT-only consensus protocols to only operate with up to 100 validators. That's an empirical number. But you will see significant delays if you kind of grow your validator set to thousands. So if you really want to have a system with thousands of validators, you better use longest chain consensus. And just to briefly mention that there are hybrid solutions that combine longest chain with BFT. So we'll grow the chain with our longest chain consensus, and then during large epochs, usually about 30 to 50 slots, we will vote in BFT style to finalize those epochs. That doesn't decrease by much the time to finality, but at least it makes it deterministic. So with these hybrid protocols, you'll know exactly how much you need to wait in order for your transaction to get finalized and to be permanently written to the blockchain. So this hybrid is achieving the best of both worlds. And the research is still ongoing, and there are even kind of proposals of how to maintain liveness, both properties, how to maintain safety and liveness by restoring liveness over time. Great. So I'll not go over Algorand. As I mentioned, Algorand is a little bit special, and Avalanche is also a special consensus protocol. But and sorry, this is disclosures because we're a regulated organization. But with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.